We've been in websites since before social media was in Australia. The biggest problem we had came in 2018. To be honest, I was making money too easily and I was not respecting the success that I had. The government changed its approach to research and development tax incentives, and that crashed all of our customers simultaneously. For something like online marketing, the rules turn on its head every now and then. And so you can be really great at it, and then all of a sudden your knowledge is now harming customers. It's in that sort of space too. You need a lot of cash. We were focused on sales growth. And at one point I calculated that for every $1,000 a week in more sales, we needed $5,000 of cash tied up in the business between raw materials and packaging and finished goods and accounts receivable. And we were young guys, we just didn't have pockets for that. You've got to feel confident about the business such that they don't get scared about their own job safety, or they'll naturally leave. The pinnacle was, basically was curled up on the floor, having trouble breathing, but really I had kind of no way through other than just to keep going.
What are your pursuits outside of business that sort of like move you and get you in flow?
Well, I mean, I've got two young sons, 2 and 5, and obviously they're a really big part of my life. Helping them encounter the world is obviously amazing.
What would your advice be today with the clear head you've got?
I think it's an old one, but...
So John, you went from being a full service agency with Butterfly to then niching down and specializing in building entire complex platforms. Talk me through that.
Yeah, thanks. When I started, the internet was really just sort of making its waves through society, and it was really hard to convince organizations that they needed to have something online. So initially we started, making websites, and whatever the clients kind of wanted, we would do it. And we evolved into what you call now a full service agency. We did that for a while. The problem is you can't be great at everything. And what we naturally found was that we were best at building things, building and supporting for long term. And that's kind of what we niched down into. So yeah, in the past, we've been very strong on online marketing, or at one point we had a brand agency, other things like that. But in terms of Butterfly, building, that's what we're best at, building and supporting for long term.
So I imagine when you had all of the categories going, like of a full service agency, and you're sort of like feeling a bit like an octopus with all that stuff going on, that you would have had to have had those be reasonably successful anyway to get to that point. So what was it that sort of tripped you over and said, you know what, this is what we're really great at?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when we look back now, something like search engine optimization, what you could do 15 years ago was quite insane by today's standard.
Like you'd move the needle a lot.
It was almost no effort, and you just had these massive results. We'd take a company from 500 leads a month to 1,500 leads a month, and they'd be unhappy because their call center couldn't cope with it.
Yeah,
and the reality is that the industry grew so fast. I started off with very much a sort of sales-driven approach. We had 5 full-time salespeople were out there. But it got to the point where our clients were naturally growing and people coming to us, and we didn't need to sell, which by the way is a terrible thing to do. That hurt us 10 years later when we had no sales capability. But essentially, the people side is difficult to have great people in all of that, especially as it's new and evolving. For something like online marketing, the rules turn on its head every now and then. It happened this year with AI. And so you can be really great at it, and then all of a sudden your knowledge is now harming customers. Now for us, we were really strong in design, really strong at building and then support long term. So everything else just kind of naturally fell away. It was kind of a couple of years later till I had the confidence, because a lot of customers would say, we want a full service agency or a one-stop shop. Or we want you to do everything. And you always get asked, can you do this, can you do that? And you're tempted in a service-based business to say yes. But it's not a recipe for success.
Yeah. Opinion. Okay. Yeah, well, that's a good philosophy. Like, they say the riches are in the niches.
Yeah, get rich in a niche. I love that saying.
So, and I like to say, go narrow, go deep. You know, like if you can find that thing that you are narrowly, like basically best in the world at, best in your category at, and then go deep on that, there might not be as many people who will get most of them.
In our product, we do websites, we do platforms. And one of the challenges we've always had is we know the theory of you get rich in your niche, but everyone needs a website. So, where do you say no to customers? Where do you focus your marketing efforts? And finding a target audience that we're good at as a company and they want to buy it and they've got the money to pay for it. That has evolved over time, and there's been shifts and changes in the market.
Yeah.
So it's something that's been I'd say a challenge constantly for us. Whereas I've got some friends with businesses and they are naturally in a niche and they've got one target buyer, and If it's a B2B, maybe they've got one target organization and one buyer, and it's a really simple sales process. Whereas for us, we get 5 phone calls a week of people wanting to spend $2,000 on a website.
Yeah.
We can't help them.
That was a conscious decision you made to sort of focus on building things, complex things.
Yeah.
What's one of your achievements you're most proud for of something you've built?
I've probably worked with startups for around 20 years, and some of my favorite projects in that area, one of them was essentially Tinder for skin cancer. And this was for a startup where in Australia, only something like 500,000 people go and see a skin cancer, get skin cancer checked once a year.
Out of our 25 million, 28 million, whatever it is now.
And if everyone went to a doctor to get their skin checked, the medical system couldn't cope. And so the concept was quite simple, take a photo and then the doctor swipes left or right. Now that it evolved, and I was quite proud of where we got to. So we had an app and people could take photos, and then doctors who were trained in skin cancer would diagnose it. And because we're collecting all this real-time data, real-time photos and diagnosis, we were training an AI to detect it. And at the time, there was a university competition for detection of skin cancer, and the algorithm that we were part of developing was outranking the top universities in the world.
Wow.
And there's a couple of key differences. They were using photos taken in a laboratory environment, and we were using user-generated content. When you're creating a new AI, getting the training data is so hard. We figured out a way to monetize that, actually get paid for it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Australia, that startup ran out of money.
Yeah.
One of the founders has moved to New York and he's trying to pursue it there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, and I suppose that'll happen a lot. And when I say, what are you most proud of? The work that you did was contributing to something like world leading at the time.
Yeah.
The environment for startups in Australia is definitely different than it is in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
So I imagine that would be challenging for someone that's working on a project that's so meaningful to not have really the herbs to be able to help it go all the way, because it's not really your responsibility to fund it. How does that feel for you when something like that happens?
Look, it's a real problem. I mean, there's a mental health app now that the founder has got a really great vision to use technology to improve the lives of people who are in a rehabilitation situation. And it's not just about helping them rehabilitate better, but it's also post-treatment making the rehabilitation stick.
Yeah.
And prevention of suicide, which is a massive thing. But there's no funding for it. And it's a real shame to see it. Going back to about 2017, I was actually bringing in startups from America to build in Australia.
Really?
In LA, for example, at that time, there's a real shortage of developers, people who can build stuff, because anyone with talent would go to Silicon Valley. And so a software engineer is the same price as a CEO.
Yeah.
And while they were outsourcing to South America or Russia, Australia is actually culturally very aligned. So we were bringing these great startups to Australia. But then unfortunately, there was a change in government policy and it kind of crashed building in Australia for startups in 2018.
Wow. Well, it sounds like on this journey, why is this meaningful to you to work on this sort of stuff?
I naturally love building things. I could see the change coming with the internet. I wanted to be part of that. And it felt very similar to what AI does now. You can feel this change coming and you feel like it's going to impact a lot of things. You're not quite sure how, but it's good to be part of it. I called my business Butterfly as a symbol of transformation because we could help businesses stop crawling around the floor and flying. But it was also about the transformation of myself into the leader that I wanted to become. And I knew that I would have to go from where I was to where I wanted to be.
Wow. It sounds like there's something in that. So the transformation of you as a person into the leader that you wanted to be.
Yeah.
I've had some experience with this personally in my sort of journey through phases and in my personal life as well. So what context was your transformation? Where did you realize that you needed this?
It's hard to say where the entrepreneurial drive came from. I did as a child play around with various money-making ventures, but I've always sort of had an innate pull towards that. And the first business associated with was turning around struggling businesses. And I turned one around in the food industry. And that's a massive success today. My business partner ended up buying me out. He still runs it now, 25 years later.
Wow. So, okay, food industry business. So you've gone in as like the SWAT team. You're here to sort this out.
Yeah.
And do they give you control to do that?
We bought it. So essentially, I've done a few turnarounds over the years and the pattern's kind of the same. You see an opportunity, you go in, everyone's unhappy, the customer's unhappy, the product has got challenges. The business is trying to do too many things. Pricing's all over the place. P&L's shot. Balance sheet shot. And you just sort of slowly work through the problems. And you're really, in many ways, just simplifying things, but you're improving things. And that when you make a change and you have an improvement, there's a really good feeling about that. I've achieved something here. And some of the things we did are so simple, but they really worked.
What's an example?
When we took the business over, it was a food manufacturing business, and it was really.
Are we able to say which one?
Yeah, the business is called Great Temptations.
Okay, Great Temptations. I like that. So this is one that really needed help when you came in. You come in with a business partner.
It was a small boutique business. They made very high quality stuff.
Yeah.
And so the founder's wife would come in and make really high quality products, but she might make 6 quiches. And if you did a costing for how much that cost, by the time you were just not making money.
Yeah.
And on the quiche front, for example, she'd hand make the pastry, and you can imagine it tasted beautiful. But the
$500 quiche.
Well, we did some shopping around, and we found a supplier of the aluminium tins with the pastry in it for cheaper than what they'd been paying for the tins.
Yeah.
And so we started making 1,000 at a time. And of course, the cost of labor really dramatically goes down.
Yeah.
But in terms of food, there's one of the challenges is the sort of personal values alignment, and the sort of high quantity food, like for supermarket type stuff. You've got to make strategic decisions or product decisions that align to that channel. So, for example, preservatives. If the product doesn't have a high shelf life, then the supermarkets will drop your product line. And it doesn't matter that they get a new order of delivery, they put it in front of the old stuff, and then they'll charge you back for the old stuff. And so delivering, we can make the most beautiful cakes in the world, but if they get delivered and they arrive smashed up, then it doesn't work. So you've got to make the product more hardy and have longer shelf life. And I don't really like that kind of food, so it didn't. There was a values misalignment there for me. But it's interesting if you look at something like Loom, the croissant business.
Yeah, I mean like Fitzroy one and the Melbourne one.
Yeah, well, she scaled that with a really high quality product. It's quite interesting to see. So I've now seen examples of scaling both the high quality and also the mass manufactured.
Yeah.
But there's other problems in that sort of space too. You need a lot of cash. We were focused on sales growth. And at one point I calculated that for every $1,000 a week in more sales, we needed $5,000 of cash tied up in the business between raw materials and packaging and finished goods and accounts receivable. And we were young guys. We just didn't have pockets for that. So we were trying to accelerate sales growth and making ourselves into a bigger and bigger hole. Yeah,
we've got to make money and we've got to generate cash. And it's sort of like water and oxygen. The making of money, profit, it's selling something at a higher cost you to deliver. But if you don't receive that money before you've got to pay out for your expenses, then you don't have oxygen and you can't breathe.
Yeah. I've definitely, that saying of oxygen is, so cash is like oxygen for a business, or profit's like oxygen for a business. I've run a business that's not profitable, and it is honestly like being underwater and being able to breathe. It's tough and it's difficult. And you've got to go into work, and your employees, you have to maintain a certain level of, you've got to feel confident about the business such that they don't get scared about their own job safety, or they'll naturally leave. And also when you're dealing with customers, if customers think there's a problem there, you're not going to acquire any new customers.
I totally resonate with that. That first one you just said there about the team. So, it sounds like there's been some challenges on the journey, like there is with any journey. And take us to one of those when you found yourself in a place that you kind of feeling like, geez, I could almost throw this in here. What was one of those examples where you had to show up?
So, we've been in websites since before social media was in Australia, since before people used their mobile phone. And we had to figure out those things along the way, and at times they were quite problematic. The biggest problem we had came in 2018, where up to that point, we'd been doing a lot of building platforms for startups, and it was going really, really well. We were having rapid growth. We were appearing on the list of the fast growing companies in Australia. To be honest, I was making money too easily, and I was not respecting the success that I had. I put the business fully under management. We had 54 staff. I was having a great life. But then the government changed its approach to research and development tax incentives, and that crashed all of our customers simultaneously. So we went from 54 staff down to 19. There ended up being lawsuits, and I got audited, and all this sort of happened all at the same time. So it was definitely quite traumatic. At the time, I was negotiating to buy another business. Over the journey, I've bought 5 businesses. 2 have worked out really well, 2 have worked out okay, and 1 nearly bankrupted me, and that happened at the same time.
There's a lot to be happening at once. So you've got you've got government changes that have affected the research and development incentives. You know, so when you're building a bit of tech yourself, or if you're doing research, and some of those were early stage investment grants, right?
Well, basically, by building in Australia, our clients could get 43% of the money back from the government. And that was part of the, at the time we were competing with people going offshore. And so that was part of the attraction of building in Australia. And it was also of interest to those offshore companies because Australia is a high-cost jurisdiction. Yeah. And what happened politically is that effectively other political groups decided they wanted that $5 billion a year to be allocated to them. And the government didn't change any laws. What they did is they instructed the tax office to basically crack down on it. It was subsequently found that the government acted really inappropriately. They've lost some significant court cases in this space. They've got into trouble in terms of I think it was the Small Business Ombudsman criticised the government in this area, but the damage was done. It killed startups, and software at the time was about half the program, and it still is. That program's still there. They didn't change any of the rules. But it had the effect of killing jobs in Australia. And the startups were building, outsourcing development to us, they lost faith in the whole thing. And whether they built offshore or, it was problematic.
So your whole world's turned upside down at this point. You've been on this meteoric rise, and then you find yourself in that situation with 50 plus people now getting reduced to sort of 19 or 20. Yes. What was going through your mind?
Well, on the people front, we'd been together for, 10, 15 years. A lot of us, we'd started together in our 20s. We'd been together for 10 years. We holidayed together. And when the business couldn't afford these people and we had to let them go, and I did my best to help them get jobs, and it didn't stop the fact that they were losing their job. And that led to a lot of ill will, and that was problematic. They were our friends. We're not their friends anymore. So our social sort of support evaporated at the same time. The pinnacle was, basically was curled up on the floor, having trouble breathing. But really I had kind of no way through other than just to keep going.
Wow. Just imagining that situation now, like you're physically on the floor, having trouble breathing because of all this crushing weight. So what did you use to pull yourself out of that?
I think, one phrase that resonated in my head was day tight containers, which is just focus on the day, get through the day as best as I can, not worry about tomorrow, and know that I'll do the best I can tomorrow. And, when I get home, be grateful I'm home. I can, with my family now, I can kind of breathe. Ultimately, I ended up sort of diving deep into the scaling up framework, and the reality is I've learned way more from this part of my business career than I ever did in the easy rapid growth.
Yeah.
Through the scaling up approach, then I came across the EO network, meeting other entrepreneurs, and I was at a point where I was kind of looking to rebuild my social network as well, and other business founders, that's my kind of people. So that's why I really, I've now got a support group that I didn't have back then.
Okay, so you've been from that moment, how you rallied people around you started with a system or a model like scaling up, which I believe in scaling up a lot. I've just implemented that to my whole group of companies. I'd previously had it just in some.
The best thing I did was the implementation of executive education. So I'd pick one chapter from the book because I self-implemented. I didn't have any money for a coach anyway. So I'd read it and then I would kind of teach it to my leadership team. And that was great because it forced me to learn the content, and then it forced me to sort of bring the leadership team on the journey, and that kind of united us together, and we could slowly, step by step, move forward. It's got quite a strong structure: people, strategy, execution, cash.
Yeah.
When we looked at people and we looked at our team, it's like, actually, we've got all these C players, D players. We're not dealing with that. Well, let's deal with that. And so, maybe that's a quarter, and you start to have these really good wins. Now, it's not all been rosy. We've struggled with our strategy. We defined a strategy, and then in the pandemic obviously happened in the middle there too. And we didn't find success. So we tried a different strategy, and then we didn't find success. And funnily enough, what's happening now is that we're finding success under the first strategy we defined, but it's, 4 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you're still in the game. So congrats on that. Because I like to say survive first and then evolve and thrive after.
Yeah.
But if we're not alive, then we can't be evolving and thriving. So Darwin's theory is playing out here. Tell me, you seem quite a resilient character.
Yeah.
to have gone through that, and I can totally understand that with that amount of weight on you, it would feel like you can't breathe. Have you always had this level of belief in yourself?
Luckily, I kind of have been pretty resilient and pretty self-reliant my whole life.
Where do you think that comes from?
I'm one of five. I'm the fourth of five, so pretty much left to my own devices a lot. I've also had a really diverse upbringing. I moved to Melbourne as an 18-year-old to study aerospace engineering, and I didn't know anyone in Melbourne. I didn't like that. I dropped out of that. I went back to Perth.
I was going to say that's not on LinkedIn, the aerospace engineering, or it might be down the bottom there. I wasn't aware of that. It's a good entry into a digital agency that then ends up building stuff.
Well, look, it was part of it because I learned how to make websites in aerospace engineering, and I was away from the industry for 5 years, and I saw how rapidly it changed. But I finished my college, I finished my university in America, and literally it seems unimaginable now, but in those days the plane tickets were paper-based, and you had one for each leg of the journey, and it was a 32-hour flight. And I literally didn't know if there was going to be anyone at the other end. And of course, I didn't have a credit card. I had money orders, or what do you call them? Just a different world. But then you get exposure to all these different things. And luckily, I've kind of been more I don't worry as much about what other people say about me. More about whether I'm happy with it or not. Whereas I do know other people who they're very affected by other people's opinions.
Of themselves, you mean?
Yeah, like some people are very vulnerable to if someone says a comment or whatever, it can undermine their confidence, and I haven't had that.
You haven't had that. So how have you steeled yourself from that? Because I know that this is, everyone's got a different factor of their likability index. 10 out of 10 likability index, like they couldn't walk past someone without gauging their reaction, and a 0 out of 10, just wouldn't even care if it's in the toilet cubicle next to them. It's just nothing. So how did you get an index like that? How did you steel yourself against that? Because I imagine in your world, there'd be a lot of people with an opinion.
When there's definitely some formative stuff. I mean, growing up in a family of five, you had a lot of, you build defenses because you fight with each other or whatever, you rib each other. When I had that food business, we were working night shift, and my business partner and I were so exhausted. We would say the worst things to each other just to make ourselves laugh. And, the worst things you can possibly imagine. And
so is this highly expletive here? We can beep it out if we have to. We're talking. What sort of things would you say?
There's no way I can say it on record.
Oh my God, it's even excluded.
But what it means is I'm a little bit immune, because if you say something really horrible about me, that'll make you laugh, and I'll congratulate you for.
Okay, so it's sort of like a joust,
Exactly.
And it's funny you say that. I know for me, when I was in the music industry and in the engineering sector at the time, I was totally cognizant that there was going to be people that didn't like our taste of music, but I didn't see that as a problem. I saw it that I needed to make really great music that I loved, because I would find a tribe of people that are like that. I would consider the spectrum of who's out there. My attempt with music would be that I wanted to make sure on first time listen that if they were partial to that type of music, they could understand the words, they could catch the hook, and they would want to listen to more. Yeah, that was my mandate, and it played out very well for live music, because a lot of our performances, we'd be supporting the Hilltop Hoods or the Herd or 1200 Techniques, where they've already the big touring act, and we need to impress the crowd to warm them up. Yeah, but it also is our opportunity to sort of be compared. So if we can rock that crowd and we're not the touring act, that's amazing. So it was easy for me if someone didn't like the music. I was like, well, they're just not our listener. Yeah. But then when I got into real estate and property, where you're building rapport, most people in your community are a prospect. So when you build rapport with someone, you're sort of mirroring and matching, and it's a kind thing to do because it gets empathy into the equation, right? So when they're talking, I can understand where they're coming from. They feel more understood and they open up more. But in doing that, I'm changing myself a lot. And for that audience, it's fine. But when it's a public audience of all these people who could be a prospect, but also have an opinion, it becomes challenging. Yeah. Because it's not like music where, that's just not my taste. Everyone's got an opinion and they all could be my prospect. So how do you think you steeled yourself from that? Do you think it was the upbringing and the jousting, or do you think it's more related to your industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, probably it's maybe answering in a different way, but when I started, I had no clue how to sell. Firstly, I was a terrible salesperson, but that's a journey in its own right. But at that time I was selling to small business owners, right? And I found I got on very well with them. But as we evolved into bigger and bigger platforms, particularly when we had to pivot away from startups, we were really selling because startups had no money. So we tried to find target audience that had money. And so we sold to medical research institutes and big bureaucratic organizations. And that's not a target audience. The people are not people that I resonate with. They're very different.
They're not founders.
No.
They're not entrepreneurial. They're in the system. Is that what I'm getting from that?
Very much so.
Yeah.
And if you're a marketing manager of a $1 billion organization, it's a very slow process. It's kind of the opposite of dealing with decision makers who can,
get on with it.
And so one of the challenges I struggle with for years there is that the not having that resonance with the target buyer.
How did you overcome that?
Well, I mean, I had good people who did that, and then they were better at it than me. And within Butterfly itself, we are still supporting that sector, and I typically don't get involved in that as much. And I deal with the founders who. That's more my natural fit.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, that does sound like it's been a pretty conscious move. Like it's almost like it's a self-awareness thing that these people I don't feel a resonance with them. And I suppose this is quite closely linked to flow.
Yeah.
They're not in flow for you because it's not freely exchanging. It's a bit unclear if everyone's getting each other. So the opposite of that though, when do you find yourself in flow? What kind of activities are you doing?
Definitely, to me, there's something about transformation. So when I'm with usually a small group of people and around a table like this, maybe the whiteboard, and we're kind of, they've got an idea and we're kind of sparking off that, time basically, is irrelevant. And I really enjoy that sort of moment of creation where you're sort of digging into a concept and just purely creating.
I love that. So, I in many of the personality profiles, I have a similar brief, like visionary, creator, artist, inventor.
Yeah.
They all sort of involve like wondering about what could be better in the world or wondering about a problem that's been presented and then inventing something to get us from where we are to where we need to be.
Yeah.
And I love seeing that hump. When we move over the hump that everyone else has thought was immovable or that they haven't thought that there was a way to navigate, they get to the blockage and go, oh, well, it's the wrong road. And I'm like, no, that's where the answer is.
Yeah. The obstacle is the way. I mean, I've worked with that many startups and the reality is they usually end up in failure. And the failure that kills them is the one they give up on. So, if you can keep going and go through it.
Yeah. You seem a very purpose-led person.
Yeah.
It feels like you need to be creating, you need to be transforming.
Yes.
And that's sort of playing out in the business and the kind of customers you're going after. What do you have in the non-business side of life that gives you that kind of feeling? What are your pursuits outside of business that sort of like move you and get you in flow?
Well, I mean, I've got two young sons, 2 and 5, and obviously they're a really big part of my life. Helping them encounter the world is obviously amazing. I read a lot, specifically audible books. I like to go for a walk around the city at 5 a.m. and listen to books and find that fulfills quite a few different areas, but I'm pretty widely read in that area.
Right. Okay. So I heard you say the obstacle is way before Ryan Holiday and you're a Stoic as well?
Yeah, very much so. It's great. Stoicism.
Yeah. I can't believe the messages from 2,000 years ago, how relevant they are.
Yeah.
And I look at these messages and I think, am I just kind of like making this fit into a box so I can say it's still relevant? But I've run the acid over it a few times and I've really dialed into a lot of Ryan Holiday stuff. I'm an audio guy too. Sometimes I read at the same time.
Yeah.
But I take in audio books at like 2.5 times speed, and that's where I really can tune in. If I go back to 1.5, I sometimes get bored. If at 1, man, I'm making other stories up in my head at the same time. What's one that you really feel has helped you with your sort of movement to this self-awareness, this actualization that you...
It's really hard to pick one.
Yeah, I'll just name a couple that have had influence.
Yeah, let me think. Definitely at the moment, I read listen to about 30 to 50 audible books a year. Who are some of my favourites? I mean, Thomas Sowell is always great. If you've come across any of his stuff.
I don't think I've read Thomas Sowell. What's the title?
So he's an economist and he's originally from Harlem, but he's must be nearly 100 now. He's got these great videos on YouTube. Yeah, definitely into Ryan Holiday stuff.
Yeah.
Jim Collins is always good.
Good to great.
Yeah, good to great. And I think there's actually one thing, if you read like a Scaling Up, it's almost like an encyclopedia. Each chapter has got references to lots of other books. But over a period of time, you can go back to the source material and read it. There's that teamwork guy. What's his name?
Patrick Lencioni.
Yeah.
I love his stuff.
They're always good. And they've got, the fable at the start for, 3/4 of the book. And then he ties the theory together.
I think there's something in that, in talking through a business model or a way of approaching life or any situation, in using a story.
For sure. Storytelling. I mean, and I think, one of the challenges I struggle with Butterfly, it's quite complex to explain what we do. And then I sometimes get envious of my friends where their business is really straightforward to explain what they do. But I think an easy story is great when you're explaining to staff and when you're explaining to potential customers and, you're spreading your message generally.
Yeah.
In a complex, abstract service. Maybe I'm overthinking it, but I tend to shoehorn too many words in there.
Yeah, it's challenging. You're definitely in a niche and you are solving some complex problems. So I imagine that story would need to change for the audience a little bit as well.
Yeah.
So like now that we've moved through that really challenging phase you're in and you've sort of come up out of the ashes, you've sort of self-actualized, you've gotten so much more awareness. There's things outside of work that seem to be docking inside of work.
Yep.
So like, what started to change when you started to align with yourself in that way? And what does your outlook on business look like now? Having been through that, what's things look like on this side of it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I actually feel that I was missing purpose in the lead up to the 2018 crash. And I was filling that with sort of hedonism type stuff.
Yeah.
Obviously having a family, children changes that. But in my business career, I'm really passionate about where I'm going and what I like doing.
Yeah.
And, I'm going to work for decades. I'm not going to retire next year. I'm going to work for a very long time. And that excites me, not just about what I'm doing now, but what I'm planning doing next. And there's some themes that I have, like I really like B2B. I have concluded that I'm better at, buying something and taking it to the next level than creating from scratch. I've taken a few businesses from $0 to $1 million. I've done that quite a few times. But I've also started businesses that failed. So I'm probably too optimistic to judge my own ideas. And therefore, if I could see another idea that is already working, but I can make it better, that to me is a lot easier.
Okay.
I have that same bias with potential employees. I see the potential in them, maybe overlook the negatives, and then later on get disappointed when they don't fulfill expectations that maybe weren't realistic anyway.
Sounds like there's some good lessons you've learned along the way with that. I've certainly learned a lot of people lessons.
Yeah.
In the way we hire and the way we align. So
I think my first book's going to be about recruitment, to be honest.
Really?
Just because I've done so much of it, and I've got a slide deck that I teach my team leaders how to recruit. And it's 170 slides long.
Wow. And maybe how not to as well, potentially.
Yeah, actually, with real live examples from LinkedIn. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can imagine there's some things you can talk about publicly on that, some things you can't, but I catch the drift. So there's a how to and how not to. So on the topic of that, what's the biggest sort of failure or mistake you've made that you're willing to share?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I'm of the philosophy that I get more value out of the learnings from failure than necessarily than I can sometimes get from success.
Why do you think that is?
Why do you think it is? Well, I think it's just a natural part of learning. You watch a baby learn to walk and they fall over more times than they don't, but that doesn't stop them from continuing forward. And I think that's true of basically every aspect of business. Some businesses, sales is very easy, but maybe, people side is very hard. It's quite hard to get good at all of them.
Yeah.
But if you do, it's very valuable in the long run, especially if you're going to be decades.
Yeah.
Which is what my intention is.
That's what your intention is long term. So you mentioned before that there's some stuff that you want to get on with, like that you're doing next and you're very excited about it. What's on the cards for you, John?
Well, I don't know the next business I buy. I don't know the industry. Like I say, I bought a few businesses already and some of them have paid off really well. So I'm pretty much agnostic to what the business is, but I have some themes. B2B, I want a shorter sales cycle, preferably something that's got a bit more of an international aspect to it, whether it be international selling or, maybe staffing internationally or something.
Right.
I'd like to take a business large. I think that's exciting for the personal growth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That does sound exciting. It sounds very aligned to what you're after. You're getting clearer on what that is. And look, as we start to wrap up here, John, because like we've covered a lot here. We're spanning multiple decades. We're spanning Australia being pre-internet, basically, or sort of pre-internet in people's phones, that's for sure.
Yep.
The way they've interacted with tech to now being in a business that's AI-enabled and solving complex problems that other people don't really want to dive into. So coming as far as you've gone and knowing that there was parts on there that you could have almost stopped, what would your advice be today to that person that was sitting on the floor trying to suck oxygen or feeling like the world was crashing down around them and thinking about bailing? What would your advice be today with the clear head you've got?
I think it's an old one, but this too shall pass. And the reality is that I have learned more out of this than I ever did in the easy success. So it's just worth putting one foot in front of the other.
I like that. Yeah, I did get it. I've had messages sent to me when I was getting bashed up in the media a couple of years ago. It's a bit of a smear campaign that was on. And it was so heavy at the time. Like there was just every way I turned, it was like someone had already gotten to them. And, it was just really hard for me to speak up about it and all that sort of stuff. And I did get a number of people send messages that sort of knew me, half knew me really well, whatever. And I was hearing like, this too shall pass, keep calm and carry on.
Yeah.
If you find yourself in hell, keep walking. And I think a lot of them came from Winston Churchill. And I reckon their situation was more dire than ours when World War II was happening and the planes were flying over. So it is good to put it in perspective. I'm really glad that you've made it through. You've done the survive. You've done the evolve. You're into the thrive phase. Your mindset seems to be really clear. You've got a lot of purpose inside and outside of the business. And it sounds like that you know how to get yourself into the flow zone and do things that really matter to you. So congrats on that and thanks for sharing your story.
Thank you very much.
All right. Look forward to chatting to you again soon.
Thanks.